On the night of September 16, 1979, two families drifted silently across the East German border at an altitude of 8,200 feet in a balloon constructed from curtains, bedsheets, and raincoats. A desperate gamble that began not with a dramatic escape plan, but with a single photograph. Peter Strelzyk, 37 years old, a bricklayer by trade, had been sitting in his kitchen in Pößneck, East Germany, on an evening in March of 1978, when his neighbor handed him a magazine that had been smuggled across the border from West Germany. The magazine was months old, its pages worn from being passed between trusted hands, and on page 14 there was a photograph of a hot air balloon festival in Bavaria. Dozens of colorful balloons rising above green countryside, people waving from baskets suspended beneath striped envelopes of fabric. Peter had stared at that photograph for what his wife Doris later estimated was nearly 20 minutes without speaking, and when he finally looked up, his expression had changed in a way that frightened her, though she couldn't articulate why at the time. Peter Strelzyk had lived his entire life within the borders of the German Democratic Republic, first under Soviet occupation, then under the rule of the Socialist Unity Party. He had two sons, Frank, 15 years old, and Andreas, 11, both of whom attended schools where they recited socialist doctrine and learned to view the West as a corrupt, decadent enemy of the working class. Peter built apartment blocks, concrete structures that housed other families like his own, families that lived under the constant awareness that neighbors might be informants, that mail was read, that telephone conversations were monitored, that applying for permission to travel to the West meant subjecting yourself to interrogations that could last for months and almost always ended in rejection. He had accepted this reality for most of his adult life because accepting it was the only way to function, the only way to get up each morning and go to work and pretend that the walls closing in around him were not actually closing in at all. But something about that photograph, those balloons rising free above the Bavarian countryside, had cracked something open inside him. Within a week, he had begun researching the physics of hot air balloon flight at the local library, checking books out on meteorology and aerodynamics, and telling the librarian he was working on a technical project for his job. Within 2 weeks, he had begun calculating lift ratios and fuel requirements, scribbling numbers in a notebook he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom. And within 3 weeks, he had approached Günter Wetzel, a 24-year-old electrical mechanic who lived 4 blocks away, and whose frustration with life in the DDR Peter had sensed during careful conversations over beers at the state-run pub matched his own. The conversation took place in Peter's basement on a Saturday evening in late April 1978, with the door locked and a radio playing loudly to mask their voices. Peter had laid out his idea in a whisper, explaining that a hot air balloon could carry a family, that it could be built from materials purchased gradually and inconspicuously, that the border guards watched the ground but rarely looked up, that the flight would take less than an hour if the wind was right. Günter had listened without interrupting, his face expressionless, and when Peter finished, Günter had asked a single question: how much weight could the balloon carry? And Peter had answered, 2 families, 8 people total if we build it large enough. Günter Wetzel had a wife, Petra, and 2 children, Peter, 5 years old, and Andreas, 2. The idea of putting them in a homemade balloon and floating across a militarized border that was patrolled by armed guards with orders to shoot anything that moved seemed less like a plan and more like elaborate suicide. But Günter had also spent his entire adult life repairing radios and televisions that could only receive state-approved broadcasts, living in an apartment where the walls were thin enough that he lowered his voice when complaining about shortages at the grocery store, watching his children begin to absorb the propaganda that would shape them into obedient citizens of a system he despised. When he went home that night and told Petra what Peter had proposed, She had stared at him for a long time before saying, "You want to kill us all." And Günther had not been able to argue with her logic, because the truth was that failure would almost certainly mean death or imprisonment, and success seemed statistically unlikely. But over the next 2 weeks, as Günther lay awake at night thinking about his children growing up behind the wall, the idea began to shift from impossible to merely improbable, and improbable was a calculation he could work with. The physics of hot air balloon flight are deceptively simple. Heat air, trap it in an envelope, and buoyancy does the rest. But what Peter and Günther discovered over the next 4 months was that the gap between understanding a principle and executing it in secret was filled with complications that could get them arrested, imprisoned, or killed. Between April and July of 1979, the two families began the clandestine process of sourcing materials without arousing the suspicion of the Stasi informants who operated in every neighborhood, every workplace, every social circle in East Germany. Fabric was the primary challenge. A balloon large enough to carry 8 people required approximately 800 square meters of material, and purchasing that quantity from a single store, or even from multiple stores in the same town, would trigger immediate investigation. Petra traveled to Dresden on a Tuesday in early May, claiming she needed fabric to make curtains for her aunt's apartment, and purchased 40 meters of taffeta from a shop near the train station. Doris went to Leipzig the following week and bought nylon in 30-meter increments from 3 different stores, telling each shopkeeper she was upholstering furniture for her mother. Peter and Günther made trips to smaller towns outside Pößneck, paying cash and giving false names when asked, returning home with rolls of cotton and synthetic material hidden in the trunks of their cars beneath tarps and tools. Peter spent his lunch breaks at the public library, researching balloon construction in technical manuals, taking notes in a code he'd developed that replaced key terms with innocuous words. Lift capacity became recipe measurements. Propane became cooking oil. Envelope diameter became garden dimensions. He checked over his shoulder constantly, aware that the librarian might report unusual research topics to local authorities, aware that anyone sitting nearby might be noting what books he examined. The technical challenges multiplied as they moved from theory to execution. The envelope needed to be airtight but lightweight, capable of withstanding heat without melting, large enough to generate sufficient lift for 8 adults and children, whose combined weight Peter estimated at approximately 560 kilograms. The burner system required propane tanks connected to a nozzle that could produce consistent flame hot enough to heat the air inside the envelope to at least 100 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature, but not so hot that it would ignite the fabric. Construction began in Peter's attic in late May, working only at night after the children had gone to sleep, sewing panels of fabric together by hand, using a machine Peter had borrowed from a co-worker under the pretense of repairing his wife's winter coats. The sound of the sewing machine was covered by a radio playing East German pop music at high volume, and the work was slow, tedious, each seam needing to be double-stitched to prevent tearing under stress. Günther designed the burner system using modified propane camping stoves, connecting 4 tanks in parallel to increase fuel capacity, and testing the flame output in the forest during hunting trips he claimed to be taking with Peter, trips that involved hiking 3 kilometers into the woods with equipment hidden in backpacks, and conducting experiments while one of them stood watch for border patrols or forestry officials. There were close calls that made both families consider abandoning the plan entirely. In June, a neighbor asked Doris why she'd been buying so much fabric, and Doris had invented a story about starting a small tailoring business from home to earn extra money, a lie that required her to actually begin taking in sewing work to maintain the cover. A Stasi officer stopped Günther in the forest one afternoon and questioned why he'd been seen in restricted areas near the border zone, and Gunter had explained he was hunting rabbits and showed the officer his licensed rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon steady. By the end of June, they had completed the first balloon, an envelope 40 feet in diameter constructed from taffeta, nylon, and cotton panels stitched together in a patchwork that weighed approximately 180 pounds when folded. The basket was a wooden platform reinforced with wire, measuring roughly 4 feet by 6 feet, with rope handles attached to the corners. On the night of July 3, 1979, both families drove in separate vehicles to a clearing 15 kilometers from the West German border, a location Peter had scouted during daylight hours and determined was far enough from roads and villages to avoid immediate detection. They inflated the balloon using the burner system, the envelope slowly rising in the darkness, filling with hot air, taking shape above them like some massive ghost. At 11:47 p.m., they lifted off, 8 people standing on the wooden platform gripping the ropes as the ground fell away beneath them. For the first 20 minutes, the flight proceeded as Peter had calculated, rising to 6,000 feet, drifting west toward the border on a steady wind. Then the wind shifted. The balloon began losing altitude, descending faster than the burner could compensate for, and at 12:31 a.m. they crashed into a field still inside East Germany, approximately 5 kilometers short of the border. They abandoned the balloon where it fell, hiked through forest in complete darkness for nearly 2 hours, reached Peter's car, and drove home in silence, knowing that, by morning, someone would find the evidence of what they had attempted. On July 4, 1979, a farmer named Klaus Hoffmann discovered a massive piece of fabric tangled in trees near the village of Heinersdorf, approximately 8 kilometers from the border. Within 3 hours, the site was swarmed by Stasi agents, forensic investigators, and officers from the East German Border Guard Command. The fabric was photographed from multiple angles. Samples were taken for laboratory analysis, and investigators began measuring the envelope's dimensions, determining it had been approximately 40 feet in diameter and constructed from materials purchased at retail stores rather than stolen from state facilities. By the afternoon of July 5th, Stasi officers had begun visiting fabric shops throughout the region, requesting purchase records for the previous 3 months, questioning store owners about customers who had bought unusual quantities of taffeta, nylon, or cotton. The investigation was thorough, methodical, and expanding outward from the crash site in concentric circles that would eventually reach Pößneck. Peter Strelzyk read about the discovery in the state newspaper on July 6th, a carefully worded article warning citizens about dangerous border violations and the reckless individuals who endangered their own families through illegal escape attempts. The article did not mention the balloon specifically, but it described an investigation into suspicious activity near Heinersdorf, and Peter understood immediately that the Stasi were hunting for whoever had built it. He sat at his kitchen table reading the same paragraph over and over, his coffee growing cold, calculating how long it would take for investigators to trace fabric purchases back to his wife, to Petra, to Gunter, to him. Gunter came to Peter's house that evening and told him they needed to stop, that continuing was insane now that the Stasi were actively searching, that the risk had become too great. Petra refused outright to participate in any future attempt, telling Gunter that she would rather live under socialism than watch her children die in a crash or spend their childhoods visiting their parents in prison. Peter could not let go of the idea. He told Doris that if they stopped now, they would eventually be caught anyway, based on the investigation, that their fabric purchases would be traced, that their only chance was to succeed before being identified. The logic was desperate but not entirely wrong, and Doris, who had watched her husband become increasingly obsessed with escape over the past year, understood that arguing was pointless. In August, Peter began constructing a second balloon alone, working in his garage late at night, purchasing materials through different channels to avoid the stores that were now under surveillance. Doris traveled to Dresden and Leipzig again, this time buying from shops she had not visited during the first construction phase, using cash and giving false addresses when asked. The second balloon would be larger, 75 feet in diameter, using stronger fabrics and a more powerful burner system based on what had failed during the first flight. By late August, Günther noticed increased Stasi presence in Pößneck, officers conducting random identity checks at the train station, cars with state plates parked on residential streets for hours without apparent purpose. He realized that Peter had been correct, that the investigation was closing in, that waiting meant eventual arrest, whether they attempted another escape or not. Günther went to Peter's garage one evening and told him he had changed his mind, that his family would join the second attempt, that Petra had resigned herself to the reality that they had no safe options remaining. The children were told during the first week of September. Frank and Peter's older son Andreas understood immediately what was being asked of them. The younger children thought it sounded like an adventure and did not fully grasp that failure meant they might never see their home again. The second balloon was completed by September 10th, hidden beneath tarps in Peter's garage alongside the modified burner system and 4 propane tanks that Günther had acquired through his contacts at the electrical repair shop. They tested the burner one final time on September 12th, hiking into the forest before dawn and igniting the flame for 30 seconds to verify the output was sufficient. Peter listened to West German radio broadcasts each evening, noting weather forecasts and wind patterns, waiting for conditions that would carry them west across the border. On the evening of September 15th, the forecast predicted easterly winds of 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, clear skies, and temperatures dropping to near freezing at altitude. Peter made the decision that they would launch the following night, and he spent September 16th at work laying bricks for an apartment complex, knowing it was the last time he would perform that job, knowing that within 24 hours his family would either be free or dead or imprisoned, and finding it difficult to care which outcome occurred as long as the waiting finally ended. At 2:37 a.m. on September 16, 1979, in a field approximately 12 kilometers southeast of Pößneck, Peter Strelzyk opened the propane valve and ignited the burner beneath a balloon that represented 18 months of planning, 1,280 square meters of fabric, and the combined fate of 8 people who had already committed treason simply by standing there. The families had arrived at the launch site in darkness, driving separately with headlights off for the final kilometer, using flashlights covered with red fabric to preserve their night vision while they unloaded the balloon and the wooden platform that would serve as their basket. The inflation process took 30 minutes, the burner flame roaring in the silence of the empty field, heating air that rushed upward into the envelope, the fabric slowly rising from the ground, taking shape, becoming something that looked increasingly capable of flight, and increasingly likely to be visible to anyone passing on the road 3 kilometers to the north. At 3:12 a.m., the balloon lifted off, rising faster than Peter had anticipated, everyone gripping the rope handles wrapped around the wooden platform as the ground dropped away beneath them with a speed that made Petra gasp and pull her younger son against her body. The basket measured 4 feet by 6 feet, barely large enough for 8 people to stand, and there was no room to sit or shift position without risking someone losing their grip and falling. They rose through 1,000 feet, then 2,000, passing through a layer of thin clouds that obscured the ground completely, leaving them suspended in darkness with only the flame from the burner providing any light or reference point. Peter tried to navigate using a compass he'd brought, holding it near the flame to read the needle, attempting to calculate their drift based on wind speed and direction, but there was no way to steer, no ability to correct their course if the wind shifted as it had during the first attempt. The temperature dropped as they climbed, falling below freezing by the time they reached 6,000 feet, and the children began shivering despite the layers of clothing their parents had made them wear. Günther's daughter was crying quietly, not from cold, but from fear, and Doris was whispering reassurances to Andreas while gripping the rope so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 8,200 feet, the highest altitude Peter dared to reach given their fuel supply. The wind was stronger than predicted, buffeting the balloon and causing it to rotate slowly, making it impossible to maintain any sense of direction except for the compass that showed them drifting west-northwest. Peter checked his watch at 3:47 a.m. and calculated they had been airborne for 35 minutes, which meant they should be approaching the border zone if his estimates of wind speed were correct. But below them there was only darkness, no lights from villages or roads, no way to confirm their position. The fuel problem became apparent at 4 a.m., when Peter noticed the flame was weaker than it had been during the first 30 minutes of flight, indicating the propane tanks were running low faster than he'd calculated. He made the decision to shut off the burner intermittently, allowing the balloon to descend several hundred feet before reigniting the flame to slow the descent, a technique that would conserve fuel but meant they would lose altitude steadily and potentially crash land in the border zone, where minefields and armed guards waited for anything that moved. Frank asked his father if they were going to make it, and Peter did not answer because he genuinely did not know. At 4:15 a.m., based on time elapsed and estimated wind speed, Peter believed they had crossed the border, but without visual confirmation there was no way to be certain, and the possibility that they were descending back into East Germany was something he tried not to consider as the fuel gauge on the last propane tank dropped toward empty. The descent accelerated at 4:22 a.m., when the burner flame sputtered and died completely, the fuel exhausted, the balloon now falling under gravity with no way to slow or control it. Peter shouted for everyone to brace themselves, to bend their knees and hold tight to the ropes, and for the final 6 minutes of flight they dropped through darkness in silence, except for the wind rushing past the envelope and the sound of Petra praying in a whisper. At 4:28 a.m., the balloon impacted the ground hard, the wooden platform hitting at an angle that threw everyone forward, bodies colliding, someone's elbow striking Peter's face, the platform tipping onto its side and dragging through mud and grass for approximately 30 meters before coming to rest in a field that smelled of manure and wet earth. For 4 minutes, no one moved or spoke. They lay in the darkness, listening for sounds that would tell them where they were. German voices, sirens, dogs, gunfire. What they heard instead was silence, then the distant sound of a car engine on what sounded like a major highway. Peter walked cautiously toward the lights in the distance, leaving the others huddled near the collapsed balloon, his legs unsteady from the impact and from 90 minutes of standing rigid with cold and fear. He reached a road after approximately 400 meters and saw a sign that made his breath catch in. His throat, white lettering on blue background in a font and style that belonged to West Germany, indicating the town of Naila was 8 kilometers to the northwest. He stood staring at that sign for nearly a minute, before walking back to the field and telling the others they had made it. They were in Bavaria. They were free. Doris collapsed onto the wet grass and began crying, her body shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with cold. Günther laughed, a sound that started quietly and built into something close to hysteria, before Petra put her hand on his arm and told him to stop, that he was scaring the children. The children themselves stood in a small cluster looking at their parents and trying to understand why the adults were behaving strangely, why their mother was crying, and their father was laughing, and why no one seemed capable of explaining what would happen next. They walked to a farmhouse approximately 1 kilometer from where the balloon had crashed, arriving at the door just after 5 a.m. and knocking until lights came on inside. A West German farmer in his 60s opened the door and stared at the 8 people standing on his porch, muddy and exhausted, and speaking with East German accents, and when Peter explained they had just escaped in a balloon, the farmer initially thought it was some kind of joke or provocation. But when he walked with them to the field and saw the massive envelope collapsed in his pasture, saw the wooden platform and the propane tanks and the sheer implausibility of what they claimed to have done, he went back to his house and called the police. West German authorities arrived within 30 minutes, 2 officers who questioned the families carefully, asking for identification documents and details about where they had launched and how they had constructed the balloon, treating the situation with a mixture of skepticism and amazement. The families were taken to a refugee processing center in Hof, approximately 40 kilometers away, where they were interviewed by West German intelligence officers who needed to verify they were not Stasi plants sent to infiltrate the West, and examined by doctors who checked for injuries from the crash landing and treated the children for mild hypothermia and shock. By the afternoon of September 17th, the story had reached international media. Photographs of the collapsed balloon in the Bavarian field appeared on the front pages of newspapers throughout Western Europe and North America. The massive patchwork envelope spread across muddy grass with the wooden platform visible nearby, physical evidence of what journalists were calling the most audacious escape from East Germany since the construction of the Berlin Wall. West German television broadcast interviews with the families, Peter and Günther explaining the construction process and the terrifying moments during the flight when they thought the fuel would run out before reaching the border. East German state media responded with articles condemning the escape as a reckless act that had endangered children, propaganda that described Peter and Günther as criminals who had abandoned their responsibilities to the socialist state and put their families at risk for selfish reasons. The families spent 3 weeks at the processing center undergoing debriefing after debriefing, questioned about their lives in East Germany, about Stasi contacts they might have had, about other people in Pößneck who had expressed desire to escape, about technical details of the balloon construction that intelligence analysts wanted, documented for understanding what was possible and what future escapees might attempt. They were given temporary housing in a small town outside Munich, assigned caseworkers who helped them navigate West German bureaucracy, and provided financial assistance to cover basic expenses while Peter and Günther searched for employment. The children were enrolled in West German schools, where they struggled initially with curriculum differences and with classmates who treated them as curiosities, asking endless questions about life behind the wall and whether they had ever seen people shot trying to escape. Peter gave an interview to Der Spiegel magazine in early October and was asked whether the risk had been worth it. He described the moment in the balloon when the fuel ran out and they were falling through darkness, the moment when he had genuinely believed they were all about to die. And he admitted that in that moment he had wondered if he had made a catastrophic mistake, if his obsession with freedom had killed his family. But standing in West Germany, watching his sons attend schools where they could say what they thought without fear, he said he believed the choice had been correct, though he acknowledged that belief might have been different if the balloon had crashed 10 kilometers to the east. Günther spoke less to journalists, but in one brief interview he mentioned his mother, who still lived in Pößneck, and who had not been told about the escape plan to protect her from Stasi interrogation. He knew she would be questioned, possibly imprisoned, and the guilt of that knowledge sat with him constantly during those first months of freedom. In September 1989, exactly 10 years after the balloon escape, Peter Strelzyk stood at the Berlin Wall watching East German citizens stream through newly opened checkpoints, and what he felt was not vindication but something closer to survivors' guilt. The families had built lives in West Germany over the decades since their flight. Lives that looked successful from the outside, but carried invisible weight that never fully lifted. Peter worked as a construction foreman in Munich, managing crews that built office buildings and apartment complexes, earning a salary that would have been unimaginable in East Germany. Günther ran a small electronics repair shop in a suburb outside the city, fixing televisions and radios and stereo systems for customers who had no idea about his past. But both men carried the psychological cost of what they had done, and their families carried it with them. Frank and Andreas, Peter's sons, had largely adjusted to life in the West, attending university and building careers that their father watched with quiet pride. But the younger children, particularly Günther's son Peter, who had been only 5 years old during the flight, required ongoing therapy for nightmares that persisted years after the escape. Dreams of falling through darkness that therapists connected directly to the trauma of the balloon flight. Peter's marriage to Doris had survived, but was strained in ways that became apparent during arguments that seemed to be about ordinary domestic issues, but were actually about the night Peter had risked their children's lives without giving Doris meaningful choice in the decision. She admitted to a marriage counselor in 1985 that part of her resented him for putting Frank and Andreas in that balloon, though she understood intellectually why he had done it, and acknowledged that staying in East Germany would have damaged them differently. Günther and Petra's marriage had not survived. They divorced in 1984, citing irreconcilable differences in legal paperwork that did not mention the underlying reality that Petra had never forgiven Günther for agreeing to the second attempt, for putting their children in a situation where death had been a likely outcome, for making a choice that she believed had been driven more by male ego and political ideology than by genuine concern for their family's well-being. The balloon escape had inspired other attempts in the years that followed, some successful, some ending in capture or death, and Peter carried awareness that his success might have encouraged others to risk everything based on the false assumption that if one family could do it, anyone could. He read about a family that attempted a similar escape in 1983 and crashed in the border zone where they were arrested. The parents sentenced to years in prison, the children placed in state orphanages, and he wondered if that outcome was somehow his responsibility. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 made the barrier that had defined their lives suddenly meaningless, and the speed with which the East German state collapsed left Peter feeling unmoored in ways he had not anticipated. His brother, who had remained in Pößneck and had been interrogated repeatedly by the Stasi after the escape, visited West Berlin for the first time in December 1989, and their reunion was awkward, full of unspoken resentment and questions neither man knew how to ask. After German reunification in 1990, the families gained access to their Stasi files and discovered they had been under surveillance for months before the escape, that neighbors had reported their fabric purchases, that the Stasi had traced materials back to specific stores and had identified both families as suspects. The files revealed that Stasi officers had been planning to arrest them, but were waiting to catch them in the act rather than acting on suspicion alone, and if Peter and Günther had delayed the second attempt by even one more week, the trap would have closed and they would have spent years in prison. Peter gave a newspaper interview in 1992 and was asked if he regretted the escape, given the trauma it had caused his children and given that the wall had fallen only 10 years later, making the risk seem unnecessary in hindsight. He explained that freedom was not just about physical borders, but about human dignity, that living under constant surveillance had been slowly destroying something essential in him, that he could not watch his sons be indoctrinated into a system that demanded they inform on their neighbors and accept lies as truth. But he also admitted that if he had known the wall would fall in 1989, if he had possessed that knowledge in 1979, he was not certain he would have risked his children's lives. The question haunted him because it had no answer, because the choice he had made could only be evaluated based on information he had not possessed at the time, and because the trauma his children carried was real, regardless of whether the escape had been necessary. The balloon itself, the actual envelope that had carried them across the border, was preserved and eventually placed in a Cold War museum in Berlin. The families visited it occasionally, standing before the patchwork fabric mounted on a museum wall. The children, who were now adults, seeing the physical object that had changed their lives and trying to reconcile the massive envelope with their fragmented memories of cold and darkness and fear. Peter stood before it in 1995 with Doris and their sons, and what struck him was how fragile it looked, how impossible it seemed that this collection of bedsheets and curtains had actually worked, how many points of failure had existed, and how close they had come to becoming another statistic of failed escape attempts. The escape had succeeded, the families had survived, the Cold War had ended. But the calculation Peter had made in 1979, whether his children's freedom was worth their lives, remained impossible to fully resolve. A question that would follow him for the rest of his days. A choice that had been simultaneously an act of courage and an act of profound selfishness, depending on which angle you viewed it from, and whether you prioritized the freedom they had gained or the innocence they had lost.